Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a high-stakes constitutional drama fueled by a truly desperate last-minute government filing. We're looking at a 2006 case from the Constitutional Court of South Africa. It was an ex parte case, which essentially means it was a desperate, one-sided application brought by the Minister of Social Development without the usual opposing parties even in the room. It's a completely fascinating look at what happens when administrative blunders crash headfirst into the strict, unyielding boundaries of constitutional law. So, picture this bizarre scenario. What actually happens when a government misses a crucial deadline, one that threatens the welfare of millions of people, and then, in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic, asks the highest court in the land to perform a legal miracle? Like, can a court simply turn back the clock to save a government from its own mistakes?
Section 1. The urgent Saturday filing. Let's set the scene here. It's the weekend. The Constitutional Court is completely closed up for business, and sudden, massive panic sets in over at the Department of Social Welfare. On Saturday, March 4, 2006, government officials literally rushed an urgent application to the court. They wanted a hearing on Monday, March 6th. Why the rush? Well, because they firmly believed a critical legal deadline was going to expire on that exact Monday. So they're asking an 11-member court, which, by the way, is notoriously ill-suited for weekend drop-ins, to convene immediately. The stakes here were absolutely astronomical. The applicants argued that without an immediate extension from the court, the people in charge of distributing welfare payments would be totally trapped. They claimed they'd be forced into a corner, either stop paying millions of vulnerable citizens entirely, which obviously causes severe distress, or continue making those payments illegally, without any lawful authority whatsoever. It's a lose-lose situation, right?
And you know what the most frustrating part of all this is? The government argued they only needed a tiny, tiny window of time, literally just 25 days. They asked for an extension until April 1, 2006. They claimed they just needed this really short delay to finalize funding under the Division of Revenue Act and to bring one single remaining section of new Social Security legislation into force. Just 25 days to prevent total administrative collapse.
Section 2. Background to the crisis.
To understand why the government found themselves in this wild, last-minute scramble, we actually need to rewind 18 months to see exactly what triggered this ticking clock in the first place. Back in 2004, the Mashava case revealed a major foundational flaw. It turned out that a presidential proclamation, specifically Proclamation R7 of 1996, which assigned the administration of the Social Assistance Act over to the provinces, well, it was unconstitutional. The whole legal foundation for how welfare was being administered was just completely invalid.
This crisis didn't just pop up overnight, it built up over years. The High Court actually found the proclamation invalid way back in late 2003. Then, on September 6, 2004, the Constitutional Court confirmed that invalidity. But the court wasn't crazy. They recognized that striking down the entire welfare framework overnight would cause absolute chaos. So they used their constitutional power to suspend the order of invalidity for 18 months. They essentially handed the government a massive grace period to get their act together, pass new laws, and unify the system.
Section 3. Calculating the deadline. Okay, so the government had exactly 18 months to act. They did the math, checked their calendars, and figured their time was up on Monday, March 6th. And that's exactly why they asked for their urgent hearing on that day. But the court abruptly informed them that their reckoning was, well, fundamentally flawed. The 18-month grace period hadn't expired on the 6th at all. It had actually passed at midnight on Sunday, March 5th. They were literally a day late. So, the crucial question here is, why were they late? It all comes down to established common law, specifically something called the civilian computation method for curial time, which is just a fancy way of saying court-related deadlines. The rule is incredibly precise. A period of time, expressed in months, expires at the end of the day preceding the corresponding calendar day. What does that actually mean? It means an order handed down on September 6th doesn't expire on March 6th. It expires at midnight on March 5th. Caught completely out by the calendar, the desperate government lawyers tried a pretty creative excuse. They argued that constitutional orders of invalidity are sui generis, meaning they are completely unique and exist in a class of their own. They essentially pleaded that because vital social grants were at stake, the court should just use a quote-unquote benevolent construction of time that magically included that last day, making allowances for how lay people might understand a deadline. Yeah, Justice van der Westhuizen wasn't having it. He swiftly rejected this excuse. He noted that prominent members of the executive branch, who are represented by the state attorney, are hardly lay persons when it comes to reading court orders. He flat out stated that departing from clear, established calculation rules would undermine legal certainty. It would be a total recipe for chaos, leaving court orders completely open to endless litigation.
Section 4. The limits of court power.
Because the government completely botched their deadline calculation, they were crossing a very hard legal boundary. Their requested hearing on March 6th was happening after midnight on March 5th. The court laid out the rules crystal clear, based on two major precedents, the Intholi and Zondi cases. Here's how it actually works. A court can suspend a declaration of invalidity. And if the government needs more time, the court can extend that suspension. But, and this is a massive but, only if they are asked during the grace period. Once that suspension period expires, the court's power simply vanishes. Poof, gone.
As the court brilliantly articulated, there is a hard absolute boundary here. The moment the suspension expired on March 5th, the unconstitutional proclamation instantly died. The time for extending a suspension had completely ceased. To grant the government's request now wouldn't be a simple extension. It would be entering the realm of revival and resuscitation. And the court explicitly stated it possesses absolutely no power to resuscitate a dead, invalid law.
Section 5. The supremacy of the Constitution. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, isn't this just a harsh legal technicality? But actually, this rigid line is the absolute bedrock of government accountability. Think about it. If a court could just magically revive a dead, unconstitutional law, they would effectively be legislating from the bench. This blatantly offends the separation of powers because making laws is Parliament's job, not the courts. It violates constitutional supremacy by allowing unconstitutional laws to stand. And finally, public policy absolutely demands finality in litigation. There has to be an end to a case.
Which brings us to a frankly blistering concurring judgment by Justice Ngobo. He highlighted the deep, frustrating irony of the whole situation. The government had 18 long months to fix this mess. They sat on their hands, remained silent, and were completely remiss in safeguarding the constitutional rights of the people. And then, at the very 11th hour, they tried to use the horrific consequences of their own failure as leverage to demand an emergency bailout from the court. Justice Ngobo did not hold back. The government actually admitted they only recognized the deadline, quote, regrettably very late. They provided zero valid explanation for what they were doing for the last 18 months. By dropping this massive problem on a Saturday, they effectively created an artificial emergency. They fully expected the Constitutional Court to bend its own rules and assume powers it didn't even have, all just to cover up their own administrative negligence.
Section 6. The final verdict.
Ultimately, the court had to make a really tough call. They had to weigh the massive human impact of potentially disrupted welfare grants against the inflexible structural limits of judicial authority. So what was the results? The court unanimously dismissed the application. The justices made it incredibly clear that they deeply cared about the plight of welfare recipients, and they even pointed out that the government likely still had administrative ways to ensure people got paid without needing a court order. But as a matter of pure law, the court firmly declared that it absolutely could not step outside the powers granted by the Constitution just to fix a government error. They could not turn back time. All of this leaves us with a final, chilling dilemma to think about. When administrative negligence threatens the most vulnerable people in society, where exactly do we draw the line? Do we expect the courts to bend the Constitution and step in with compassionate intervention, or must the strict rule of law remain absolute, even when the consequences are dire? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to ponder that one.